I want to tell you about the day I went down to Lower Bay 9 to log a sensor anomaly, and came back something I had no name for. That's how small it started. A warm reading alert on a decommissioned bay. 3 lines on my morning queue, the kind of ticket nobody else wanted because Lower Bay 9 was on sub-level 4, which meant 2 lifts and a climb down a maintenance ladder. And the bay itself smelled like cold iron and old atmosphere even through a rated filter mask. Nobody went down there willingly. The commandant's office had been routing anomaly tickets for 9 to whatever clerk was lowest on the morning roster for as long as anyone could remember, because the sensor array in 9 threw false readings roughly twice a month, and the standing order was document, tag, close. 15 minutes of work tops, assuming both lifts were operational. I was the lowest clerk on the morning roster. I had been the lowest clerk on the morning roster, in one form or another, for 6 years. My name is Marin Solis. I was a logistics and inventory clerk, 3rd grade, assigned to Cradle Station Verath, a supply depot and way station orbiting the dead moon called Verath's Eye. Verath's Eye had no resources worth extracting and no atmosphere worth breathing, which made it ideal for a depot. Quiet skies, no competing interests, a stable orbit, and a deep cold that cut heating costs in the lower bays significantly. The station itself was old. Not the oldest structure in the sector, but old enough that its lower sublevels had been built before the current colonial administration's record-keeping standards, which meant there were rooms and corridors and sealed bays on the station blueprints with no corresponding entry in the modern inventory system. Nobody had signed those spaces in. Nobody had signed them out. They simply existed, the way old things do, below the line of what anyone currently living thought to question. Lower Bay 9 was one of those spaces. The official entry in the station's active asset register described it as decommissioned vessel bay, non-functional environmental seals, no access, fire risk assessment pending, ref. 7 Tau 2201. Reference 7 Tau 2201 had been pending for 41 years. I knew this because I had, at some point in my first year on Verath, tried to close out the backlog of pending assessments as a personal project, a way of demonstrating initiative. The initiative had gone unnoticed. The assessments had not been completed, because completing them required access to bays that were sealed, and unsealing them required authorization from the commandant's office, and the commandant's office did not consider 41-year-old fire assessments a priority. I had filed the obstruction, logged the attempt, and moved on. That is broadly a portrait of my 6 years on Verath. I filed things, I logged things, I moved on. I was not unhappy exactly. Unhappy implies a baseline of expectation against which the present registers as insufficient, and I had learned early not to carry high expectations about what Cradle Station Verath would offer me. I had come from Hale Colony, a mid-tier agricultural World 2 transit jumps out, where I had also been a clerk, a different kind of clerk, in a different kind of office, for a different kind of unremarkable institution. Before Hale, I had been on the transit circuit for 18 months, picking up short-term contracts on whatever station would have me, which was most stations because I was competent and quiet and did not cause problems. Before the transit circuit, I had been on Marath, my birth colony, which I had left at 22 because there was nothing there to hold me, and I seemed, from a very early age, to be a person nothing held. I have spent time since thinking about that quality, the not being held. At the time I understood it as a deficiency, something in the way I moved through the world that failed to engage the mechanisms that anchor other people to places. Friends made on Marath and then let drift. A position on Hale that was solid and well regarded, and that I nonetheless departed without anguish. Transit postings that suited me fine for their contracted duration and left nothing behind when they ended. I told myself that some people were simply not built for roots, and I filed that as a fact about myself and moved on from it, the same way I moved on from everything else. It did not occur to me until the day of the door that not being held might have been a feature rather than a deficiency. That the particular gravity that holds most people in place was absent in me for a reason, and the reason was that I was intended to keep moving until the correct thing stopped me. My grandmother used to say, "The ship knows its own." She said it the way people say things that feel true without being explicable, not as metaphor, not as mysticism, just as fact, the way you might say water runs downhill. I asked her once what it meant. She looked at me in that way she had, like she was seeing something slightly behind my left ear rather than my face, and said, "When you find the right one, you'll know." I was 8. I thought she was talking about a pet, or a friend, or maybe a horse, the way grandmothers sometimes spoke in parables aimed at a child they imagined understood more than she did. She died when I was 11. I never asked again. I thought about that phrase sometimes in the years between Marath and Verath, in the cheap bunks of transit stations and the narrow quarters of mid-grade colonial postings. The ship knows its own. I had no ship. I had never served on one long enough to feel any ownership in either direction. I was a clerk. I rode in the holds in the passenger cabins of other people's ships, on the way to other people's stations, to do work that other people needed done and that I was capable of doing, and that satisfied the basic requirements of a life without ever quite becoming the shape of one. I was 34 years old on the morning I went down to Lower Bay 9, and I had not yet found the right one, whatever that meant, and I had mostly stopped expecting to. The warm reading alert had come in at 6:10. I picked it up at 6:40 when I signed on, reviewed it in approximately 40 seconds, confirmed it was a Bay 9 ticket, confirmed I was the low clerk, and went to the equipment locker for a filter mask and a hand scanner. Our maintenance chief, Orrin Havitt, was at the locker when I arrived. Havitt was a broad, slow-moving man in his 60s with a white beard trimmed to military regulation length, despite the fact that he had not been in any military for 30 years. He watched me pull the mask off the rack. "9, he said. 9, I said. He was quiet for a moment in the way that Havitt was often quiet, not for lack of thought, but as if he were choosing which of several thoughts to give away. He had been on Verath for 22 years. He had been down to 9 exactly once, he'd told me in my first month, to run a structural check after a micro-impact registered on the hull sensors near that level. He had not described what he'd found. He had only said when I'd pushed him, "Whatever's in there doesn't want to be bothered, so don't bother it." "It's just a sensor ghost," I said, because it always was. "Sure," he said, and handed me a second battery pack for the hand scanner without being asked. "Take the stairs on sub 3. The second lift's been stuttering since yesterday." I took the stairs. The descent to sub-level 4 took 11 minutes on foot. The station's lower levels had been built for function rather than comfort, bare metal corridors, cable runs exposed overhead, lighting at 70% and yellowed with age, the hum of environmental systems a constant presence rather than background noise. The lower you went, the more the station shed its pretense of being a place where people lived and revealed what it actually was, a machine for keeping things in one location, old and indifferent and patient. Sub-level 4 was colder than the rest of the station by about 4 degrees. That was normal. The insulation down there was original construction, which meant it was old enough to have settled into a permanent state of marginal inadequacy. You felt sub 4 in your hands and the back of your neck within a minute of arriving. The first 2 levels of descent had some traffic maintenance workers, the occasional courier, a team from engineering working on a conduit that had developed a fault overnight. By sub 3, the corridors were quieter. At sub 4, I had not passed another person in 5 minutes. The lighting here was dimmer and had a faint yellow cast from decades of bulb age and insufficient replacement. The metal walls showed their structural ribs clearly, without any cosmetic paneling, and the rivets were old enough that some of them had developed the specific tarnish that meant pre-colonial manufacture. a distinction I had learned to recognize in my first year, doing the archive indexing project, when I'd had a reason to care about what was original and what was not. Bay 9 was at the end of a service corridor that had no other bays off it. The corridor was 40 meters long and straight, and it terminated at a blast door that was, at minimum, 3 times the thickness of any other blast door on the station. I had measured it once out of curiosity, 1.8 meters of solid alloy, with a locking mechanism that predated any current standard and had no visible interface panel. There was no handle. There was no keypad. There was a seam around the door's edges that was perfectly fitted, so perfectly that in 6 years of twice-monthly visits to run the sensor ghost protocol, I had never been able to slide even a sheet of printout paper into the gap. The door had never been open. Not in the living memory of anyone on the station, not in the administrative record going back 160 years, not in the station's original construction documents, which I had once obtained from the Colonial Authority archive on a slow afternoon and read with the thoroughness of a person who had nothing better to do. The construction documents described Bay 9 as existing structure, integrated at build, do not modify ref, pre-colonial designation Veth 9. Pre-colonial, the station had been built around it. The corridor smelled different from the rest of Sub 4. Elsewhere on the level, the smell was machine oil and old insulation, and the faint chemical note of recycled atmosphere running through aging filters. In this corridor, there was something underneath those smells that I had never been able to identify with certainty, something older, something that came from behind the door in a quantity too small to measure, but somehow present anyway, like the memory of an odor rather than the odor itself. Cold mineral, perhaps. Stone in the way stone smells when it has been cut by tools that have long since ceased to exist. On the wall beside the blast door, at about shoulder height, there was a sensor panel, current hardware, recently cabled in as part of an upgrade project 6 years ago. That panel was the source of the warm reading alerts. It was also the only piece of station equipment in the corridor, because there was nothing else in the corridor to monitor. The sensor had been cabled to Bay 9's interior atmospheric monitor, which meant, technically, there was an atmospheric monitor inside Bay 9, which meant, technically, someone at some point had been inside Bay 9, or at least had been able to run a cable through the door, which was not possible because the door had no visible gap. I had flagged this inconsistency in a memo once. The memo had been filed and not responded to. I held the hand scanner up to the panel and waited for it to handshake. Standard protocol. The scanner would pull the panel's read history. I would confirm the warm reading was a sensor drift rather than an actual thermal shift. I would tag the ticket closed, and I would go back up the stairs and have the terrible coffee that the break room's dispensing machine produced. The panel handshook at 6:58. I pulled the read history. The warm reading was not a sensor drift. I stood there in the corridor, in the 4-degree cold with the yellow light overhead and the hum of the station's bones all around me, and I read the panel's data 3 times because I did not trust what I was seeing. Bay 9's interior atmospheric temperature had been reading at approximately -41 degrees Celsius for as long as the panel had been in place, 6 years of continuous data, steady as a held breath, varying by less than a degree across all of it. That was consistent with a sealed, unpowered, deep cold bay. That was normal. Overnight, between 200 and 600, the interior temperature had risen 47 degrees. It was currently reading at 6 degrees Celsius. Cold but habitable, the temperature of a refrigerated storage room, the temperature of a space that was no longer unpowered. I stood there for a long time. The thing I remember most clearly about those minutes is the quality of the silence. The corridor had always been quiet, the equipment was sparse and old, and whatever lay behind the blast door had never made a sound in 6 years of visits. But the silence that morning was different. It had a texture to it, the way silence does when it is the pause before something rather than the absence of something. I had never been good at describing things like that. I am telling you about it now because it was so clear at the time that it seems dishonest to leave it out. I did the correct thing, which was to open a report on my station tablet and begin logging the anomaly. I noted the temperature rise. I noted the time window. I noted that the rise was linear, not sudden, steady, like something warming up rather than something failing. I opened the ticket protocol for non-standard anomalies, which required me to pull the Bayes asset record before I could categorize the finding. The Bayes asset record in the current system was, as I have said, minimal, decommissioned, no access, fire assessment pending. It contained a link to a legacy file from the pre-administrative record, which I had never followed before because legacy files on Verath were stored in a format that required a secondary reader application I had never bothered to install on my station tablet. I had installed it 3 weeks earlier, during a slow afternoon, because the station's archive project had pushed through a batch of newly digitized pre-colonial records, and I had been assigned to index them. The reader application was already on my tablet. I followed the link. The legacy file for Bay 9 was old enough that the reader rendered it in a plain text format with no structure, just lines of text in a typeface the system had approximated from the original encoding. The document appeared to be a vessel registration record. The Bay's pre-colonial designation, as the construction documents had noted, was Veth 9, but the asset was not the Bay. The asset was the vessel inside the Bay. Its name was the Unbroken Veth. The registration record was fragmented, missing sections, corrupted fields, the gaps marked with placeholder characters. What remained was vessel class heavy carrier, first watch configuration, hull registry pre-colonial era, first expansion, status at registration, sealed for long hold, crew aboard, cryo standing protocol awaiting signal of return. There was a crew count. I read it once and looked at it a long time. The crew count was 612. At the bottom of the record, in a field labeled Officer of Record Founding Command, was a name. The name was Solly's. I read it several times. Then I read it aloud, very quietly, standing alone in a 40-meter corridor on sublevel 4 of a freight depot orbiting a dead moon, because sometimes the mind needs the mouth's confirmation. Solly's, I said. The blast door opened. Not quickly, not like an alarm or an emergency release, where the mechanism engages in a fraction of a second. Slowly. The way something opens when it has been closed for 11,000 years and is taking care with the threshold. The seam I had never been able to find appeared first. A line of light, gold amber and warm, tracing the door's edges from the bottom up, as if the light were rising rather than switched on. Then, over perhaps 30 seconds, the door moved. Inward, not outward. It pivoted on hinges I had not known were there, and as it moved, the light from inside Bay 9 grew and the temperature changed. I felt it on my face before I registered it consciously, a warmth I had not felt in that corridor in 6 years. I did not step back. I tell you this not as a boast, but because I find it genuinely puzzling even now. By any reasonable measure, I should have stepped back. A sealed space with 600 sleeping people in it, and an unexplained temperature rise and a door that had just opened on its own. The correct response was to step back, to call station command, to wait for someone with more authority and more equipment. I had done the correct thing once already that morning and it had been fine. I could have done it again. I stepped forward. I have thought about why in the years since. The best I can offer is this. It did not feel like danger. I have been in genuinely dangerous situations. A hull micro breach on a transit station at 26. A pressure event in a storage module at 30. In those moments the fear was immediate and physical, a thing in the chest and the throat. What I felt standing in front of the open door of Bay 9 was not that. It was closer to the feeling I had once had at 8 years old, when my grandmother had taken me to the agricultural fair on Marath, and I had turned a corner between 2 exhibit stalls and seen, for the first time in my life, The open grassland of the colony's central plain stretching to the horizon with nothing in the way. The sensation of a space that was exactly as large as it needed to be, and that had been waiting for you to arrive in it. I stepped through the door. The bay was enormous. That was the first thing. I had known, intellectually, that it was large. The station's footprint at sub-level 4 was considerable, and Bay 9 occupied a significant portion of it, but knowing the dimensions from a blueprint and standing inside the space are two entirely different experiences. The ceiling was 30 meters overhead. The bay was perhaps 120 meters long and 60 wide. The floor was clean, not recently cleaned, but clean in the way that sealed spaces are when nothing has been in them to make them dirty. The air tasted like metal and something else I could not identify, something faintly mineral, like the inside of an old stone vault after rain. And filling most of the bay, from perhaps 6 meters inside the door to the far wall, was the ship. The Unbroken Veth was not the largest vessel I had ever seen. I had been on transit freighters that were longer, but it was the oldest, by a margin so large it was difficult to hold. The hull was dark, a deep charcoal gray with undertones that shifted toward blue when the light caught it at certain angles, a material I did not recognize and could not name. The surface was not smooth. It was carved. Across every panel I could see from where I stood, the hull was inscribed with a pattern that was not decorative. It was too precise and too dense for decoration, the lines running at angles that suggested function, structure, meaning. The patterning covered everything from the waterline of the hull's base to the upper curves of what I thought must be a forward section, and it was fine enough that from 30 meters away it read as texture rather than text. But it was text. I knew that the moment I saw it, the way you sometimes know things before you can account for knowing them. The ship sat on its own landing geometry, a series of cradles built into the bay floor, also old, also patterned, and it was not touching the walls. There was perhaps 4 meters of clearance on each side. The boarding ramp was already descended, a long, shallow slope leading from the bay floor up into the hull's midsection, its surface the same carved dark material as the rest of the hull, the incline gentle enough that you could have walked a loaded cargo cart up it without difficulty. The ramp's edges were lit, that same gold-amber warm light, steady, not flickering, emanating from the carved lines themselves, as if the lines were a circuit and the light was what flowed through them. I walked to the base of the ramp and stood there. The clearance on both sides of the hull let me see the ship's full profile from the bay floor, a heavy forward section, wide across the beam, tapering toward a stern that was partially obscured by a structural element of the bay's own architecture, a crossbeam from the original construction, dating, I suspected, to the same pre-colonial era as the ship itself, built to give the Veth exactly the clearance it needed and no more. A station built around a ship. Built to hold it and to hide it and to allow it to wait. I thought about the engineers who had done that. I thought about what they had known and what they had chosen not to put into the record. I thought about the 41-year-old pending fire assessment and the way that information, if you accumulated enough of it, eventually becomes a portrait of the thing everyone quietly agreed not to look at too directly. The inscription on the ramp's surface was deeper and more deliberately spaced than the hull's patterning, not fine texture but individual marks, each one perhaps a centimeter wide, running in a single line down the center of the ramp from top to bottom. A title perhaps, a name, a welcome. I could not read it. I knew I could not read it. I started up anyway. Somewhere inside the ship, something was producing a low, sustained sound. Not a mechanical sound, not the sound of engines or pumps or any system I recognized. It was more like the sound a very large vessel makes when it is fully and quietly alive at anchor, the deep background resonance of mass and atmosphere, and whatever it is that separates a ship that has crew aboard from a ship that does not. I had heard something like it once on a decommissioned colonial carrier at dry dock, visiting for an audit, and a veteran cargo pilot who was with me had said, You can always tell a ship that's been loved. They carry it in the hull. The unbroken Veth carried it in every surface. I climbed the ramp. The incline was gentle, and the surface held its grip well, not through any visible texture, but through some quality of the material itself that I could not account for. My boots found purchase that felt deliberate, that felt like the ramp was cooperating. Probably that was my imagination. Probably. The inscription running down the ramp's center was at its densest near the top, the marks closer together, the depth of the carving greater, as if this section had been given more care than the rest. I ran my fingers along it as I climbed, not to read it but because I was in the mood to make contact with everything I passed, to confirm by touch that it was real, and that I was real, and that both of us were here. The material was warm under my fingers. Not the warmth of a heated surface, the warmth of something that had been used, worked, inhabited for a very long time by people who cared about it. The interior corridor at the top of the ramp was wide enough for 4 people walking abreast and lit entirely by the carved line illumination. No separate fixtures, no cabling, just the lines themselves, running along the walls and ceiling, producing a warm, diffused light that made the corridor feel inhabited rather than eerie. The air inside was warmer than the bay, perhaps 10 or 11 degrees. Comfortable. The floor was clean and the walls were smooth between the carved lines, and the proportions were slightly larger than I would have expected in a human ship. Wide doors, high ceilings, the measurements of a vessel built for people who wore more than standard work clothes in the corridors. Who wore, I would understand later, the full equipment of the first watch's standing protocol. Suits that included life support layers, communication arrays built into the shoulders, the inscribed line pattern of the watch's Rankan service record woven into the fabric itself. The corridor branched once, about 10 meters in. Left and right, both branches continuing into the deeper interior. Straight ahead, the corridor continued toward what my sense of the ship's geometry suggested was the forward section. I went straight. The carved line lighting was slightly brighter ahead than behind, a gradient, subtle, the same effect as a room with a candle held by a host who was showing the way. The corridor opened, after perhaps 20 meters, into a space I understood immediately despite never having been in one, a cryo bay, a large one. The ceiling rose to perhaps 8 meters, and lining the walls on both sides were columns standing cryochambers upright, each one a capsule roughly 2 meters tall and half a meter wide, arrayed in rows 3 deep along the port and starboard walls. There were a great many of them. I did not count them then. I know from later accounting that the number in that bay was 152. They were all occupied. You could see it through the chamber panels. Each one had a viewport, approximately the size of my hand at face height. The panels were opaque when I arrived, misted with the transition from deep cold to habitable temperature, but as I stood there the mist cleared on the nearest ones and I could see, dimly, the occupants. Faces. Still. The specific, composed stillness of cryo, not the stillness of death, but the stillness of a held breath, of something that has been waiting and knows how to wait. They were in uniform. Not any uniform I recognized. A dark, close-fitted garment with the same pattern of carved or inscribed lines that covered the hull, rendered in lighter material against the dark base, so that each figure seemed to carry the ship's language on their body. Some had their eyes closed. Some were open, not awake, but open, the unseeing of deep cryo, the eyes resting on whatever the inside of a dream is when the dream has lasted 11,000 years. I stood at the entrance to that bay for longer than I can account for. 152 people in cryo-standing protocol, in a sealed ship beneath a freight depot, waiting. The chamber nearest to me on the starboard wall held a figure whose face was visible through the cleared viewport. A woman, perhaps 40. Her expression in cryo the specific composed blankness that deep stasis produces. Her close-cropped hair a dark reddish-brown that the warm light of the inscribed lines picked out in amber undertones. On the shoulder of her uniform I could see, even through the misted chamber panel, a specific arrangement of the inscribed pattern, a cluster of lines that was different from the rest, heavier, more deliberate. I understood without being told that it denoted rank. I understood without being told that the rank was significant. I walked deeper into the bay, past the first row of chambers and the second. The lighting tracked me, not dramatically, not with any sudden shift, but the warm amber glow was slightly brighter ahead of me than behind, a subtle gradient, as if the ship were a room with a candle held by a host who was showing me the way. At the far end of the cryo bay, the corridor continued. I followed it. It opened into a second cryo bay, identical in proportion to the first, with its own rows of standing chambers, also occupied. I did not stop long in the second bay. The third was shorter, a single row on each wall, with chambers that were individually distinguished from the others by having their inscribed line patterning arranged in the same deliberate cluster I had noticed on the first bay's shoulder-ranked figure. Officers, perhaps. Senior command. 24 chambers in the third bay, all occupied, all sealed. Then a corridor that widened, its ceiling lifting another 3 meters. This corridor was different from the others. The carved line illumination was heavier here, the lines thicker and more numerous, running not just along the walls and ceiling but across the floor as well, a grid of them, fine and bright, so that walking the corridor felt like walking through the inside of something that was fully, consciously alive. The sound the ship produced was louder here, or perhaps more present. It had a frequency that I felt in my chest rather than heard with my ears, a low sustained resonance that I associated later with what Seren described as the ship's active attention. The unbroken Veth, in the state of having found the thing it had been waiting for and directing the whole of its processing capacity toward the confirmation. The corridor had 6 doors, 3 on each side, all sealed, all with the same locking mechanism I had last seen on the blast door to Bay 9, that same fitted seam construction, the same absence of handle or keypad. These would be crew quarters or equipment bays or sections of the ship's systems that the watch had sealed separately from the cryo bays when they went under. I did not try any of them. I walked straight to the end. It opened into a space I recognized as a bridge, or what a bridge would be on a ship 11,000 years old, designed by people who had been doing something rather different from the transit routes and freight runs that constituted my experience of space travel. The bridge was large by any standard, circular, roughly 20 meters across, with stations around the perimeter, each one a console of that same carved line material, dark and lit from within. There were 4 chairs, forward-facing, looking at what I understood was a view screen or a forward window, currently dark, currently reflecting only the room itself back at me. The chairs were occupied. Not by sleeping cryo figures. These 4 were different. They sat upright, fully suited in the inscribed uniforms, helmets sealed. Their hands were on the console surfaces. They were not in cryo, or if they were, it was a lighter version because their chests moved. Barely, slowly, one breath every several seconds, but moving. Their helmets faced the dark forward screen. I understood that I was looking at the watch standing its post. 11,000 years, standing its post. I stood in the entry to the bridge for a long time, not stepping further in. I had walked through 3 cryo bays containing several hundred sleeping soldiers and their attendant officers, and I had not disturbed them, and I did not want to disturb these 4. But they knew I was there. I did not need any technological confirmation of that. The ship knew, and where the ship knew, the watch knew. After a moment, the forward screen illuminated. Not with an exterior view. With text, that same inscribed script from the hull, but now moving, running left to right in lines I couldn't read, line after line building rapidly until the screen was full, and then pausing, as if waiting for my response to something I had not yet been given the capacity to read. I said, "I can't read that." The script cleared. A new line appeared, slower, in a rendering that my eyes translated as standard colonial text despite its clearly different origin, as if the ship were choosing a language it knew I carried. Officer of record, founding command, lineage confirmed, state your name. My throat was dry, I swallowed. Marin Solis, I said. Logistics clerk, 3rd grade, Cradle Station Verath. I came down because of a sensor anomaly. I paused. I don't know what's happening. The screen was still for 3 full seconds. The 4 figures at the forward consoles did not move. Then the ship spoke. Not through the screen. Not through speakers I could locate. Through the hull, through the walls, the floor beneath my feet, the air in the room, the way a sound is present in every surface when the source is the structure itself. A voice that was not a voice the way I had ever understood the word, more like the quality of a mind finding the correct channel, the sound of 11,000 years of waiting oriented toward a specific point. Blood of the first watch. 5 words, clean, certain, the way you say a thing you have always known and waited to say. I felt it in my sternum, that line. I felt it in my hands. I am not a person who cries easily. I had not cried in front of anyone in years, but my eyes went hot, and I did not entirely succeed at preventing what followed. And I am not ashamed of that now, standing far enough from that moment to understand what I was carrying without knowing I was carrying it. The ship said at once, that was all it needed. Blood of the first watch. What happened next was not fast. The unbroken Veth did not produce a fleet, did not launch, did not declare anything to the colonial administration or the sector authority or anyone else that morning. What it did was wake, slowly and carefully, the way something wakes when it has been asleep a very long time and knows that the waking needs to be done properly. The 4 watch officers on the bridge were first. Not all at once, the leftmost figure, the one whose helmet faced slightly toward where I had entered, turned its head. A single degree of rotation, perhaps 2, but after 11,000 years of standing stillness, that movement landed with the weight of a door opening. Then the other 3, by increment, degrees of movement returning to bodies that had not moved since before the current colonial administration had existed. I did not approach them. I sat down on the floor in the entrance to the bridge, because my legs had decided that standing was a less important project than remaining upright in some form, and I watched. The helmets came off last, 4 people, 2 women and 2 men. The one who had turned first was the nearer of the 2 women, middle years, the same reddish-brown hair I had seen through the cryo-chamber viewport on the officer in the first bay, though this woman wore it longer, pinned back at the collar. Her eyes, when they found me, were the gray-green of deep ocean water, steady and clear and calibrating, taking in the bay, the lighting, me. In that order, methodically, the way a person runs a systems check on waking environment first, then situation, then the individual. The other 3 followed a similar sequence. They were neither young nor old, these 4. They were the specific ageless of people who have lived enough to carry weight and have carried it long enough to no longer need to show it. The second woman, seated at the forward right station, had a face that was deeply composed, the kind of composure that is not absence of feeling but the long training of feeling, the way certain craftspeople hold their hands when they have done a thing 10,000 times. The 2 men were similar, present, methodical, reading the situation. Not alarmed by me. Not alarmed by anything, in the way of people who had already made their accommodation with the most alarming possible scenario, the very long wait, and had simply done it, and were done with the accommodation now, and were ready to work. The one who had turned first spoke, not in colonial standard, in something else, something I could hear but not parse, with a cadence that my ear registered as formally structured. The ship translated, not by speaking over it, but by resonating beneath it, so that I heard both the original and the meaning simultaneously, the way you occasionally can when you know a language well enough to hear the structure and the meaning at the same time. She said, "How long?" Not a question, a request for a number. I told her. I gave her the 11,000 years that the registration record had offered me, which I said carefully because I was aware that 11,000 years is a number you deliver gently. She received it the way I imagine you receive a number like that when you are a soldier of the first watch, and you put yourself in cryo knowing it might be a long time, with the specific stillness of a person who had already decided before they went under that the number might be very large and had made their peace with it. She looked at the other three. One of them closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them, then nodded. The woman to the forward right said something brief and low that the ship translated as, "Noted." The two men said nothing at all. They turned back to their consoles and began to work. "The signal did not come," the first woman said, "through the ship's resonance in the double layer of language and meaning. So you came instead." I said, "I don't know how. I didn't know any of this was here." She looked at me the way Havett sometimes looked at me when I said something that he found too humble to be accurate. "You read the name," she said. "Our last officer of record, Solly's." "She was my grandmother's grandmother's grandmother, maybe," I said. "A long way back, I don't know how far. She died when I was 11. She never told me." "She knew enough to come here," she said. "She knew to stay near the station, and she knew to pass it down." I thought about my grandmother's phrase, "The ship knows its own." I thought about how 11-year-old me had assumed she was speaking in metaphor. She had not been speaking in metaphor. "What did she pass down?" I asked. "I don't have anything, no information, no codes, nothing. I came down here on a sensor ticket." The watch officer looked at me steadily. Her face was tired, not with the fatigue of the morning, but with the longer tiredness of someone who has spent 11,000 years at standing post and knows that the next phase of the work is beginning, and that the work will not be easy. But there was something underneath the tiredness, something I had to look directly at to see. The specific relief of a person who waited for something specific and has now seen it arrive. "You have the name," she said, "and you have the blood. The ship needs nothing else." Behind her, on the walls of the bridge, the carved lines were completing a pattern I had not noticed building, running from the perimeter toward a central point forward, all of them converging, brightening as they met. The ship was continuing its wake. In the cryobays behind me, through the walls, I could hear, or perhaps feel, it was difficult to distinguish, the beginning of the same process multiplying outward. 612 people in cryo-standing protocol, after 11,000 years, following the wake sequence because the blood of their last founding officer had walked the deck and spoken her name, and the ship had answered. I sat on the floor of the bridge of the unbroken Veth, and I watched the first watch come back. It took several hours for the full wake sequence to complete. The cryo-standing protocol, as Seren explained later, had been designed for exactly this kind of extended hold, not the standard cryo of a 6-month transit, where you go under and come up, and the adjustment is a day of disorientation and a week of recalibrating your body clock, but something built for an indefinite duration, a system that could maintain 600 people in a state of near-perfect physiological suspension for as long as the ship's power architecture held. And the ship's power architecture had held. It had been designed to hold. The first watch had built this vessel to outlast any weight they might have to make, and they had built it correctly. The waking sequence unfolded in phases that I could track through the sound and the light. The cryobays warmed in sequence, not all at once, and as each bay reached its threshold temperature, the lighting in that section of the ship shifted from the deep amber of standby to the brighter gold of active state. I could track the progression by where the brightening was happening. First the third bay, the officers, then the second, then the first, the sequential logic of a command structure waking from the top down. By the third hour, the light through the bridge entrance to the cryo corridor was fully gold, and through the walls I could hear, feel, the specific sound of very many people becoming present in the world again, the collective low frequency of 612 minds engaging, the ship carrying them the way a harbor carries a fleet coming in from long voyage. I am going to tell you something about that process that the official accounts do not emphasize, because the official accounts were written by people who arrived afterward and experienced it as a political and strategic event. I experienced it as a quiet, not the absence quiet of the corridor before the door opened, the other kind. The quiet that exists inside a very large, very old, very serious thing doing the thing it was built to do, finally, after a wait that would have broken anything less than what it was. The ship was not dramatic about it. The watch was not dramatic about it. They woke the way soldiers wake when there is work, deliberately, without ceremony, taking inventory of themselves and their situation and proceeding. The four on the bridge were at their consoles within 20 minutes of removing their helmets, reading the 11,000 years of accumulated station data that the ship had been passively collecting through the sensor cable that I had never been able to explain. They already knew about Verath. They already knew about the colonial administration and the sector authority and the current state of human expansion. The cable had been doing that work for 6 years, since the station's upgrade project had unknowingly plugged them in. The information they were reviewing was not current events. It was the full historical record, every publicly archived colonial document, every sector treaty, every administrative structure, every mapped transit route, the whole shape of humanity as it existed now, collected and processed and waiting for them the same way the Bay had been waiting for me. The watch officer whose name, I learned over the following hours, was Seren Salis Dareth, a compound of her founding bloodline and the name she had taken at her commission, 11,000 years earlier, came and sat down beside me on the floor at some point during the second hour. Not because there wasn't a chair available. I think because I was still sitting on the floor, and she understood that I needed company rather than formality. "You've been here 6 years," she said. "Yes. And before that." I gave her the short version, Hail Colony, Transit Circuit, Marath. She listened with the specific attention of someone cataloging information rather than simply listening. At the end she said, "You moved a great deal." "I did," I said, "nothing held." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is the line that's specific to us. We found it in our first generation. The founding blood doesn't settle easily among people who don't know what it is. Pulls toward transit, pulls toward margins, pulls toward the edge of things." She looked out at the bridge, at the 3 other watch officers working at their stations, at the hull lines completing their convergence overhead. Pulls toward stations that have something sealed in their lowest bay. I did not have anything to say to that. I sat with it. After a time I said, "What do you need? The 600, the whole crew, what do you need from me?" She looked at me with that tiredness and that relief together, the compound expression I was beginning to recognize as the watch's characteristic register. Right now. Somewhere to begin. An introduction. A name that means something in the current administrative structure. A clerk, perhaps, who knows where everything is filed and how the station systems work, and who to call when you need something unsealed. I thought about 6 years of lowest on the roster mornings, and twice-monthly sensor ghost protocols, and pending fire assessments and memos that went unanswered. I thought about being the person nobody sent to anything important, the person the station used for sub-level chores because she was competent and quiet, and would do the work without complaint. I thought about what it means to know where everything is filed, and to have no one who particularly cares that you know. "I know where everything is filed," I said. Seren Salis Dareth looked at me with something that was not quite a smile but was the ancestor of one. "I know," she said. "The ship chose well." There is an official account of what happened over the following weeks on Cradle Station Verath. I'm not the one who wrote it, and it covers things I was not present for and omits things I was. Commandant Drail Toss was, to his credit, more adaptive than I had expected. The presence of a 600-person crew from the first watch era does tend to clarify one's administrative priorities. The sector authority arrived 17 days later. The colonial administration sent 3 separate delegations in the first month. Have it when I came back up from sub-level 4 that first afternoon, 8 hours late, with no coffee and wearing the expression of a person whose classification of the world has recently been revised, looked at me for a long moment and said, "I told you it didn't want to be bothered." I said, "It wasn't bothered." He thought about that. Then he said, "Good," and went back to his work. The unbroken Veth did not leave immediately. The watch was thorough, and thorough meant a careful accounting of the current human situation, of the centuries and millennia of history they had slept through, of what their presence meant and what their obligations were, and how those obligations intersected with what humanity had become in the years since they'd last been awake. Seren explained to me, over a series of conversations in the weeks that followed, that the watch had been the first expansion's response to what they called the Long Dark, a series of deep space incursions in the pre-colonial era, before the current colonial administration, before most of the history that I had been taught was the beginning of things. They had sealed themselves into the unbroken Veth at the end of the last campaign, when the Long Dark had gone quiet but not gone away, and the founding officers had made a compact. They would wait, in cryo standing, for the signal that it had begun again, or for the return of the founding line, whichever came first. Neither signal had come. The line had drifted, as lines do, dispersing through the generations and the transit routes and the colonial expansion, attenuating until it was one woman on a freight depot doing logistics work on a sub-level sensor anomaly, which was apparently sufficient. "The line doesn't need to know what it is," Seren told me once. "It just needs to be, and to find its way to the door." I thought about my grandmother again. I thought about moving. I thought about how I had spent 6 years on a station I had never managed to feel was the right one, never quite settling, never quite belonging, and how I had come down to sub-level 4 on a morning like any other morning, and found the thing that had been waiting for me in the lowest, coldest, most ignored corner of the place I had ended up. My grandmother had known to come near the station. I do not know how, perhaps she too had followed something she could not name, had felt the pull toward the margins and followed it until she found the closest point she could manage, and then settled there and had children and passed the phrase down the only way she knew how. In a sentence, a grandchild wouldn't understand until she needed to. Perhaps she had tried the door once herself, and it hadn't opened, and she had understood, in the way of someone who knew something of the long game, that the door would open for the right moment in the right generation, and all she had to do was keep the name alive and the blood near. She kept it alive, she kept it near. I have thought about that often in the years since, the patience of it, the faith of it, the particular love that chooses the long way of doing something because the short way isn't available, and does it quietly, without explanation or ceremony, and trusts that the thing at the end of the waiting will know what it received. My grandmother did not know me well. She died when I was 11, which is not a great deal of time to get to know a grandchild, particularly one who was quiet and unremarkable and showed no signs of being anything other than a person who would grow up and do work and live reasonably and not make a great deal of fuss. She gave me 2 things, the phrase and the name. That she preserved the name tells me she understood, at some level, what it meant. Solly's was not a common colonial name. It was specific, it was old, and it pointed to something she must have known pointed somewhere. She put it in me and trusted me to carry it to wherever it needed to go. I carried it, without knowing I was carrying it, for 34 years and however many light years of transit. The unbroken Veth had been waiting longer. I am not a logistics clerk anymore, which I mention not because the title matters, but because it represents a change in what the work is, and the work is what I am made of. Seren offered me a position on the unbroken Veth, in the early weeks, not a combat role, not a command role, but the role the ship had understood she was offering before she said a word. Officer of Record Founding Command, the position that had been listed as vacant in the ship's register since the last Solis had died generations beyond counting. The position that the ship had been holding for 11,000 years, like a seat kept at a table, like a light left on. I said yes. I want to be clear that I said yes without hesitation, which surprised me, because I had been a person who hesitated about most things for most of my adult life. But there was no hesitation in it. The hesitation requires a question, and there was no question. The ship had asked it 11,000 years ago, and I had answered it by existing, by moving, by finding my way down a maintenance corridor to a blast door and reading a name aloud. The work is large. The long dark, as it turns out, has not stayed quiet. There are things at the deep edge of the current expansion that the sector authority does not have a good framework for, and that the Watch understands with the terrible, specific clarity of people who have faced them before, and sealed themselves in cryo, rather than let those things find humanity unprepared. We are preparing. The Unbroken Veth is not the only sealed ship. There are others, and finding them is part of what the next period of the work involves, which is where a person with 6 years of filing experience and a working knowledge of how colonial administrative records are organized turns out to be useful in ways I find quietly satisfying. There is a particular kind of pleasure in being correctly used. I had not understood how much I had been waiting for it until it arrived. The work is serious, and the stakes are large, and some of it frightens me in a way I take care not to show when I am among the Watch, because the Watch does not show fear easily, and I do not want to be the one who imports it into the ship. But underneath the seriousness and the scale there is a constant low warmth that I have not felt in any of the places I passed through before. The warmth of a place that is correctly yours, that fits you in the specific way a thing can only fit if it was made for you or you were made for it. The ship knows its own. I know what I am now, and the knowing is something I carry the way the Watch carries their cryo-standing years, not as a burden, but as part of the substance of the self. I told Seren once that I had spent most of my life feeling like I was the wrong fit for everywhere I'd been. She said, "You were the right fit for what was waiting. You were just early." I have been thinking about that for a while now, about being early. About the 11,000 years, the Unbroken Veth spent sealed in a freight depot's sub-level bay, its hull carrying the names of its crew in lines so fine they read as texture from a distance, its watch at standing post, its temperature at -41, its sensor cable plugged into a station that didn't know what it was connected to. About what it takes to wait that long for the right thing to arrive, and about what it means to be the thing that arrives, finally, not because you were trying to be, but because you were the one who was. And about my grandmother, about a woman I knew for 11 years, who gave me a name and a phrase and died before I was old enough to ask the questions that would have helped me understand either one. Who must have known or felt or simply trusted that the name and the phrase were enough. That a grandchild who went looking, even if she didn't know she was looking, even if she filed sensor anomaly tickets and drank bad coffee and moved from colony to colony and never quite fitted anywhere, would eventually find the door. My grandmother's phrase doesn't need interpretation anymore. I know what it means, the way you know things you have earned rather than been told. The ship knows its own, and when the ship says so, you don't argue, you step forward, you say your name. You let the door open.